Today's episode is brought to you by Checkfront, the booking platform trusted by over 5,000 tour and activity operators around the world. You can start your own free 21-day trial over at checkfront.com.
Welcome to the Tourpreneur Podcast. Travel industry veteran Shane Whaley will take you on a journey with fellow tourpreneurs, sharing their tips, ideas, insights, and success stories to inspire you to make your tour business the best it can be. And now, here is your host, Shane Whaley.
Hello and welcome to episode 159 of Tourpreneur. This is the podcast where we flatten the learning curve for tour operators and travel professionals around the world. Today we are joined on the show by Trish Higgins. She is the CEO at Captain Fish's Cruises over at Boothbay in Maine. So the cruise company has been around since 1936, and Trish came along beginning of 2020 of all times and bought that business. And today she's going to share with us the importance and the power behind financial statements. Now, don't run away, because I know if you're anything like me, I get scared by the F word. I only really do my books when it's tax time, so when I have to. However, I know from speaking to many of you, this is an area we can definitely improve upon. And Trish is going to share why it's a good idea, other than keeping the taxman happy, to keep good books. Trish has bought over 20 small businesses from landscaping to tours over the last 6 years, and she shares with us some best practices. So if you want to sell your tour business at some point, she shares with us what she was actually looking for. We also talk about what it's like to take over a business that's been around for 80 years. A lot of scared people, a lot of scared staff. Maybe that will be you in the future. Maybe you will buy a business, especially right now with COVID. Who knows what may happen? And you have to take over new staff. How do you put them at ease? How do you go about having a full staff experience? By that, I mean onboarding, recruiting, retraining. Right now, how you go about attracting tour guides. We know that many outdoor, nature, adventure, water-based tours are really struggling to get tour guides, especially during the week. So this one is packed full, chock full of excellent information on the operational side of running a tour business, on the financial side, and of course, it's Tourpreneur. So Trish drops 3 value bombs on us that will help us grow our tour business. So without further ado, notice how podcasters always say that. I don't say it in my real life. Let's move over. Let's speak with Trish Higgins. Welcome to Tourpreneur episode 159 to Trish Higgins. How are you, Trish?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for approaching us with your story, because when I first read your story, I was like, wow, this is incredible. And normally when we start a conversation on Tourpreneur, we go through your value bombs. We focus the show on the 3 value bombs that you want to share with other tour operators or tourpreneurs in waiting around the world. And towards the end of the conversation, I ask our guests to share a nightmare situation and how we overcame it, because I think there is a lot of lessons in that for us. In your case, I want to bring that forward, if I may. And if you could tell us about your nightmare situation and how you overcame it. So maybe you can share with our listeners, when did you acquire Captain Fish?
Sure. So we acquired it at the very end of February 2020.
Wow. That's probably the worst time in the history of the travel industry to acquire a tour business, right?
Yeah, it was when we were working to close the deal. COVID was sort of in the news, in China. And, it seemed like a very distant thing. And we closed the deal, and about a week later, everything shut down. And that was very unfortunate timing. Didn't feel great.
Yeah, I mean, I sympathize with you. In January of 2020, I was on a cruise ship around the Caribbean. And of course, same thing. It was happening over there. It wasn't happening here. And now I shudder when I think that I was in that Petri dish of a cruise.
Exactly.
So walk us through those first couple of weeks. I want to share a little bit more about why you acquired the business, but talk me through those couple of weeks. You've bought the business, you're excited. Then what happens?
Sure. So when you first buy a business, there's a lot of logistical things that need to happen. So the first week, while COVID was starting to become, more in the news, I was mostly focused on, making sure things like payroll came over and those accounts were set up and, our registrations were up to date and, all of the sort of administrative stuff that comes when you buy a business and sort of is very urgent. That is what I was initially focused on. Then our business operates, we're based up in Maine. So I have yet to find a lot of people who want to go on boat tours in January in Maine. So we open in mid-May and close in mid-October. And so, the purchase was organized to happen in the off season. And so at first, there was really one very key employee that, I had to sort of introduce myself to as the new owner, which was a surprise. And that's always, never like a super fun conversation to have because, a lot of times people felt like they were left out of the process of the sale and a little bit betrayed by a former owner. And, you're this new person, they don't know you, and they're always concerned about how things are going to go for them. So in a weird way, in retrospect, the fact that COVID was starting to hit actually gave us a little bit of common ground to relate to, because we were going through this thing together. At the very beginning, we were closed down. So it was more of a, hopefully this will be over in a month at the time. And I felt like every week almost we've had to reevaluate what the situation is. And, even just recently, the past couple of weeks with the Delta variant, we've had to reevaluate things again. So that was just the very beginning of us having a lot of conversations.
So you are a unique guest for us here at Tourpreneur because you've been involved in acquiring more than 20 small businesses. So for instance, in this case, and if we can put COVID to one side right now, I know it's difficult to do, how would you ordinarily have a conversation with an employee, particularly because Captain Fish's Cruises has been around since 1936, 80 years, family owned. It's like an institution. You come in as a new owner. And I know that this has either happened to some of our current listeners or those in the future who go on to acquire another tour business. What was your approach with the existing employees?
It's always a bit nerve-wracking. And that first meeting with the employees after you've bought the business. And I think it's nerve-wracking for everybody because the people in the business, they don't know you. It's a surprise. And I think very often people sort of assume the worst. They, sort of assume new owner equals bad. Also, everybody, I think rightly so, thinks, how is this going to impact me? Is this person going to terminate me? Are they going to change the compensation structure? Are they going to change the, required working hours, the standard? Maybe they're just going to come in and they have their own team and they're going to get rid of everybody. And I think especially when you hear a lot about, I think, negative acquisition outcomes in the news. On the flip side, from my perspective, my anxiety would come from, I bought this business because it's a good business. And the reason it's a good business is because there are competent people who are working here that I would very much like for them to stay, because if they leave, things are actually a lot harder for me. And so in that first meeting, like underlying sort of all of the conversation, the people you're interacting with have this sort of like, are you going to fire me sort of question at the back of their head? And at the back of my head, or people that I work with, the back of our head is, are you going to quit on me because I just bought the business? And so there's a little bit of awkwardness, and experience has helped us kind of understand that no matter what we say in that first meeting, the only way to gain trust is to be around people for a period of time. There's things you can say in that first meeting that really turn people off. If you come in and are super egotistical and, just rub people the wrong way, that's not good. But there's really nothing positive that you can say, in my opinion, that's going to make people be like, oh yeah, a new owner bought the business and they seem great, so we'll just carry on as usual. It takes time to build relationships with people. And so I now feel a little bit less anxiety about that first meeting, but it still is something that, like, for every acquisition we've done, I remember that first meeting because it is a very symbolic thing. It's and then you just kind of get through it and show up for the next day to, get to work.
So for our listeners who may at some point be interested in selling their tour business, what advice would you have? So for the other side, so what were some of the, the best practices you've seen as a buyer that our listeners could learn from?
I work with my husband and my brother-in-law. So it's family-run business, and we buy small businesses from retiring owners. And we have purchased businesses in a wide range of spaces, not just tour operators, but tour operating businesses. We really like the space, and something we, are involved in now and are hopefully will become more involved in over time. And so I sort of give that background to sort of say we've looked at a wide range of businesses in a lot of geographies, in a lot of industries. And there are certainly some commonalities that we see from a buyer perspective that are very important. The first one is that it is very hard for a buyer to evaluate your business if you don't have your financials in order. And for a lot of small business owners, they don't really have to have their financials in order. They have been in the business, living it for a long period of time, and they know in their gut how they're doing. And if the amount of cash that's in the bank account, keeps going up, then things are good, and there's no real need to spend a lot of time making sure your financials make sense. And that is totally fine. You're right. You're running the business, and that's the way it is. And, candidly, a lot of small business operators, run their business to minimize their profits. And, you're running your own business, that's your prerogative. But if you're looking to sell your business because you're looking to retire or just move on to something else, it's very hard for somebody coming in that hasn't lived in the business and doesn't just sort of know that it makes money, for them to just take your word for it. Like, when we look at a business, we're looking at the profits and then figuring out what we think is a reasonable price based on the profits. If your business, doesn't show profits, you have to have the ability to have your financial statements organized enough to say, well, these are the, sometimes people happen to run personal expenses through their business. So it's, my business says 0 on my tax return, but, really I'm running these personal expenses through and be able to itemize and prove those things. And so the most successful transactions we've had are when somebody, has understood the importance of having clean financials. And by clean, I just mean typically prepared by a bookkeeper, and that they have that for at least 3 years before we start talking to them. So it doesn't mean they've been doing that for 3 years. It just means that they've worked with a bookkeeper so that they can send us 3 years of financial statements, and we can understand, okay, looking at revenue, this is where the revenue is coming from. These are where the costs are. And this is what the profit is. So it doesn't have to be something that's super sophisticated and granular to get kind of into accounting language. Most small businesses use cash accounting, which is just, when cash comes in, you record it. So an example of that would be if I sold a ticket in February for a trip in July, most small business owners would just book that as revenue in February. Even though technically it's actually not revenue, it's a deferred liability and unearned revenue. But that is not something I think a small business operator really has to care that much about. They could if they wanted to. It's something that we would do once we own the business. But when I'm talking about clean financials, I'm really just talking about, can I see the buckets of your revenue for the past couple of years, the buckets of your costs, and can you answer kind of basic questions about it? And I think that's the most important thing, that if you don't have that, you might say, well, my business is worth $5 million. I'm just making up numbers. And I'd say, well, based on your numbers, it's worth $500,000. And we're never going to bridge that gap because you can't prove to me, like, how much money your business actually makes. So that's the most important thing. And it does cost money to hire a bookkeeper. It is these days pretty easy to find a cheap, often virtual bookkeeper. I've actually never met my bookkeeper in real life.
You segue nicely into your first value bomb here, which is get your books in order. And that's whether you were wanting to sell your business or just to run an efficient business. So on that question then, for the virtual bookkeeper, for all our listeners who are now nodding their heads, because most operators I speak to don't know their margin levels, and most operators are doing deals with resellers and OTAs without fully understanding the margins. So I think this is really critical advice for all of us. So in terms of getting a virtual bookkeeper, where did you find yours? Was it a website? Was it an agency? Or
ours is somebody who's actually in Southern Maine. I just Googled sort of remote. At first it was sort of part-time CFO, remote bookkeeping. And there are some larger firms that will do this for small businesses, but I just happened to find this smaller firm that does all virtual work that, they happen to be about an hour and a half away from me, but they could be anywhere. And I did meet with the owner. She kind of talked to me about, what systems to use, how to get things, all set up. And then a person on her staff, I work with, I probably email her once or twice a week. And, she sends me questions as she has them, and she prepares the financial statements for me to look at, and we'll flag things like, there's usually a line that says ask the client, which is like, I don't know where these expenses go. And, it's an ongoing, evolving thing. It's not like, oh, we just set it once and it goes. Like, we're always kind of looking at it. But to your point, the basics is just sort of, if you want to sell your business, being able to have them to show your profitability. I'd say like the real power of financial statements is being able to use them as a tool to manage your business, not just as something that's a throwaway document. So if you're taking full advantage of everything, accounting has to offer, you can understand your profit by trip type. And you can understand then if you're giving discounts, how is that impacting your margin? Or you can say, hey, we're running a ton of this type of trip, but it actually is a lower profit than our other trip because, maybe it's a longer trip and you burn more fuel and you have to pay more labor hours. And you can say, hey, it's actually more profitable for me to run these other trips that are shorter. And so either I need to shorten my trip length a little bit for the unprofitable one, or consider increasing the costs on those ones to bring the profit up. And so I think that if you're using the financial statements, I think the way they're supposed to be used, you can use it to make decisions based on like what the levers are in your business.
So smart. Yeah.
It takes a little bit of work to get there, but starting with a bookkeeper and then just basically spending time looking at them and asking questions about, well, if this went up, what would happen to that, is how you get the most familiar with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do feel that this knowledge is lacking in our sector. I'm talking more about the smaller tour operators. And I think most of us only, and I'm hugely generalizing here, and if you disagree with me, feel free to email me, come on the show, comment in our Facebook group. This is a two-way conversation. But for me, for instance, when I'm doing my books, it's mainly for my taxes, because I'm terrified of the IRS and I never want to get that,
We all are.
It's not like what you're talking about was, okay, using the financial statements to plan your business and grow your business. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And I would love to see someone, and maybe it exists out there in the industry, someone that could actually give us almost like a mini MBA on the financial side of, okay, you're running a tour business. This is the financial systems you need to set up. This is where you can go learn and do it yourself, or this is where you can go and get a bookkeeper, etc. And I'd love to see that course available for operators, because I think it's something most of us really struggle with.
Having had exposure to many industries, it is not just this space. Most small business, owner-operated businesses, very, very common. It would be very rare to have somebody who was, really digging into the financial statements. If you get the right system set up, it is actually can be quite easy. But you have to have the right system set up. If you're trying to do everything yourself, or you're trying to do everything with paper or like all these things, it can be quite cumbersome.
I think you need to write a book for tourpreneurs, Trish. Tell us how it's done. Are there actually any books or tools or apps that you recommend for tourpreneurs who want to get better with finances?
I don't remember the name, but it's accounting basically taught from the perspective of running a lemonade stand. It might just be like how to run a lemonade stand or something. You can get it on Amazon. But it introduces you to pretty much every financial concept you need to know to run a tour operator business. And it does so, I think, in a way that is easy to understand and relatable to what you're doing here. So we actually have that book in our office and give it to a lot of people who are starting, just so they get a sense of what they're looking at. And so I'd say that for reading. In terms of systems, QuickBooks Online or Xero with an X, Xero, those I think are the two leading cloud platforms. We use something it used to be called Receipt Bank, and they just merged with something. So I think they're called Dext. And that's a really easy way to manage all of your bills that need to be paid and your receipts and stuff like that. And then we don't have a high volume of bills to pay, but if we did have a high volume of bills to pay, we'd also use something called bill.com, which streamlines a lot of your bills, makes it really easy. So those are kind of like the three big systems that I would recommend.
Brilliant. And if you could maybe email me after the show the name of the book, I'll make sure we add it to our show notes, which everyone can find at tourpreneur.com/159.
Did you know every weekday Shane curates the most interesting news articles in tours and activities and sends them out in a snappy daily digest? Grab your copy of the Tourpreneur Daily Briefing at www.tourpreneur.com.
I want to move on to your second value bomb. You share with us that we should focus on the full employee experience. How do you mean exactly?
And I would caveat this where I still have a lot of work to do in this realm, and I'm not exactly, the leading expert in this. It's not like I have perfect employee experience. What I have come to believe is that in a lot of small businesses, especially tour businesses, especially when you're seasonal, often people who are not with you year round, they may come back year to year, they may not. They may be, for us, we get a lot of college kids who work for us. It could be their first job. It's a very unique workforce, paid hourly. And I think it's very common for people just to show up. For us, it's boats. You get thrown on a boat, it's kind of like figure it out. I think that to set people up for success, you need to do a couple of things. And what we've done is spent quite a lot of time in developing and onboarding. So on the first day, people come in and said, listen, like, these are what our values are. These are what our expectations are. This is what we do from a employee policy perspective. So, this is what the uniform is. This is who you ask if you have a problem. This is, how you get paid. Pretty basic stuff. Even, things that I think shouldn't need to be said, but we have a zero tolerance policy for sexual harassment. If you show up drunk, you're going to be fired. If you show up late 2 times, you're eligible to be terminated, things like that. And so, one, we have an employee handbook that we spent quite a lot of time on that outlines all of these things. We share that with our employees. We have them sign it. And then we have a presentation on their first day that takes the key critical points of the handbook, and we go through and say, this is what it's expected of you. And I think that just helps make people understand what our standards are. And it also gives us a connection with the employee before you kind of get into the craziness of the day-to-day. Did you do this? Did you not? It's sort of you're establishing a relationship based on what our norms are.
Do you spend many nights sitting at your desk trying to figure something out in your booking system to make it work better for your business? With Checkfront, you'll always have access to a friendly support team who's quick to reply with a step-by-step solution no matter what you need help with. Find out other ways Checkfront can make things easier for you at checkfront.com/tourpreneur.
I've managed hundreds of salespeople, and the one lesson that I have learned in the last 20 years is your norms are not their norms. And what we think is acceptable behavior is not always how someone else views it. So I love hearing that from day one. It's like, okay, here's the handbook, here's our values, this is how we work, here's our expectations. You're making that abundantly clear from week one, that you won't tolerate people, not being punctual, or even saying, hey, it's not a case of being strict. If you're not here and we've got the boat's ready to go out, you're going to hold up 20 people. Do you have any idea how that affects us with revenues, with reviews, etc.? All of that, just setting that expectation is so important, because our norms are not their norms.
Yeah, and it is incredible what you think you don't need to tell people that you really do. And it's not to say, you do this, put together this handbook and you do an onboarding session that for us usually lasts about an hour, and then everything's perfect, right? Like, obviously not, but it does help at least establish like the common language you're using. And I think it helps set the tone for the season. And so, there is some conversation on, okay, well, you're paying people to come in and, you're paying for them for the time. And, is it worth it? And, I would argue that it is. That's one thing we do. And, for all of our business, that's something that's a non-negotiable for me. We have developed a bit more of a on-the-job training program. There was nothing previously like formal in the business. It was all kind of done. They certainly did training, but it wasn't as structured. So we have implemented, I call kind of like version 1 of our training program, which I think is well received. I think you can always do more training at the get-go. We have a little bit of a tricky problem where, our season starts slow. So not everybody is necessarily there all at the beginning of the season. And, we'll have some people leave midsummer to go back to school and other people start who are staying through the fall. And so finding time to train those people who aren't there at the very beginning is honestly something that we still try to do, but it's not quite as good as it could be. And I have yet to kind of figure out how to do that, because once you're in the season, for us, everyone's sprinting and finding the time can be difficult. We try our best. The other things we do are we do a mid-year survey to give people an opportunity to share how things are going. And I'd say some of the feedback is productive, some of it's not. It's anonymous, and it just has some basic questions.
How do you respond to that, Trish? So if you get some negative feedback from an employee, it hurts, right? There's even with the thickest skin in the world, you read negative feedback about management or the way the business is run. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, I cry for a while first.
Wow, you're human. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. It sucks. I mean, when you get bad feedback, for me, I always feel like I've been punched in the gut, or like I feel ill, And I think the first thing you have to do is say, is this one person who, has this issue, or is there a pattern of negative feedback? Because what you don't want to do, because I've made this mistake, you do a survey, you get the feedback, and then you reactionary freak out mode, be like, well, this one person said this. And so like now, like everything has to change. You kind of like go on a rampage. And just tactically, what I do is I, first of all, never read survey results before you go to bed at night. Just like that's a bad idea. I read them in the morning, and then I do nothing, and I wait a full day, and then I read them again. And then I try to like parse them out into like what's productive here, what's not. And then I'll sort of summarize them, not by person, but by sort of question, put similar things together. And then I'll share that with my team, and we'll talk about, and what I have started doing is I have my own opinions, but I like to share it with my senior team and say, before I tell you what my thoughts are on this, like you look at it and you tell me what your thoughts are, so that I don't bias them with like, hey, I don't think this is that big of a deal, or I think it's a huge deal, or whatever, because they're going to take their cues from me, right? Then, and then we kind of just talk about, hey, there's, some of the things are, I'm confused about what this policy is, and I don't know that, those are kind of the easy ones of like, somebody doesn't know how to do this and they're raising it. Let's address that. Some of the other ones that you can get are just, if somebody has a problem with somebody else, it's like an interpersonal problem. Those are always the trickiest ones. But I think it's important to do so that people feel like they're being heard. the ones that are addressable, we try to follow up with. And then we do an end of season survey too. And not surprisingly, the end of season surveys tend to be more candid.
Yeah.
Because sometimes if somebody knows they're never going to come back, they'll, tell you what they really think. And that's fine. I feel like my perspective is I'd rather know the bad stuff so that we can try to fix it as opposed to pretend that something, isn't there.
Yeah.
And then the final thing, just on the employee experience, we do a couple of, we do a beginning of season barbecue, mid-season, we had everyone come. We did like a trivia night on the boat and had a nice dinner and kind of that sort of thing. We'll do an end of season barbecue. I'm a little wary of doing too much employee stuff because like I myself in my personal time would rather be home with my family.
Yes.
So I try not to force, a lot of non-work social activities on people, but I do think that those things have a way of, bringing people together. And I thought the trivia night was really a good idea this year because we forced people who don't necessarily work together to be on the same teams. We also invited spouses and partners to come. So you get to kind of meet everyone, dogs too. And so we got an opportunity for people who don't normally interact, like somebody who might be in a ticket booth, for instance, interacting with somebody, being on the same team as a captain and a crew member, something like that. Forcing the interaction between the team, I think, was very good for morale and a pretty easy thing to do. And then the final employee thing is that we do have an anonymous hotline that we've set up.
Wow.
And I can send you the link for it. And I think that one's really important in case there is anything weird going on that you want to know about. It's completely confidential, completely anonymous. We put the signs up for what the link is in our ticket booth where people check in and, clock in and clock out. We have it in the handbook. We try to make it available. And we encourage people if they're having, if they notice, somebody said something inappropriate to them or things like that people are often hesitant to bring up. We said, we want to know. The only way we can know is if you share it. People typically don't want to share their name.
Has anybody ever used the hotline?
We've had a couple people use it. Yeah. And it's things like, I think so-and-so, maybe coming to work, having had a couple drinks. We had one, so-and-so behaved in a way around me where I feel uncomfortable. It was a female employee and it wasn't like anything overt, but it was sort of I just feel uncomfortable around this person because I've got a couple things that have happened and little things at the margin. It's really great for us to know about them so that if it's a big issue, we can look into it and potentially take action. But then if it's something where it's, maybe we're not going to put those people together on the same boat or something like that. And I think it's just good to know that for me, I'm doing everything I can to be available.
Yeah.
And if somebody chooses not to share something with us, then fine, but they can't say they didn't have an avenue to share.
Absolutely. How do you go about retaining staff? Because what I'm hearing right now, especially with outdoor adventure, nature-based tours, it's really difficult to get guides in the first place because many guides, what I'm hearing, for instance, is we can get them on the weekend, but during the week they're doing other jobs and it's stable money, so they don't want to risk tourism. And then how do you just go about retaining? I imagine where you are, it's quite competitive with different water-based tours. How do you retain the staff? Other than excellent barbecues and trivia nights and bring the dog.
So, we don't retain all of our staff. We certainly do have turnover year to year. We try to pay well. So we probably pay, this year's weird, because
you don't have to go into specific numbers.
Things are crazy, but we pay more than the average in the area. In non-COVID years, we try to provide a lot of hours. We are out on boats, and there is a subsect of people who love being out on boats. So that helps us. That it's sort of a fun job in that way. We also have the Maine Maritime Academy has a lot of students who will work with us for the summer, and they will get college credit for it because they do a project on our boat, and they also get sea time. So that is huge for us because it provides us with a stable sort of group of people who they're not going to be there for 5 years clearly, but they might come back for 2 summers and they might mention it to a friend who's there who might come. And so that is a very important pipeline for us. The nice thing about the business being around for a long time is there are locals who know the business and, maybe worked there, 10 years ago and, want to pick up like 3 or 4 days this week, this year. And so we kind of have a host of those people. And in the past, the company has used the J1 program.
What's J1?
It's a student visa program.
Right, got you. Okay.
Yeah. And so student visa program, we provide housing for them. We've had, people from all over the world, but
Fantastic.
Typically most are Eastern European countries, and they're students who have to apply to be in the program. So they tend to be quite motivated and they come and they want to work. It's great.
Well, what tips do you have for interviewing? Because I know this is something I hear from most of our guests and listeners, that we struggle with the interviewing process. So let's narrow it down. Let's say it's to tour guides, for instance, rather than captains, because I know that's very specialist. What are some of your tips? What are some of your secret tactics when you're interviewing someone to work out if, for instance, they will be compatible with the values that you've set for the business?
Personally, I think I suck at interviewing. So
okay.
I'm not sure I'd take my advice, but I actually really like to ask people what their goals are, because we want people who want to be there, who are self-starters, who are, not just here because they need a job and a paycheck. But I have found that people who have goals, not necessarily professional goals, but personal goals, like you want to retire when you're 40, or you'd like to run a marathon, or, you want to bake a amazing souffle. I don't whatever it is. It's really interesting to me how people answer that question, because some people don't have any goals.
Yeah. Is that a red flag for you?
It is.
Right.
It is. Because our season is short. It's a sprint. You need to be a self-starter. You need to be somebody who wants to do a good job at what you're doing. And to me, if you don't have any goals in life, you're probably not going to have the attitude to make it. So that's something I really like to ask people. For us, it's hard because it's college kids, they don't have a breadth of stuff to go off of, but just trying to get a sense of culturally whether they'd fit in. Are they somebody who's going to be really high maintenance and, always have an issue with the schedule and not want to do the dirtier parts of the job, and, just think they're not really going to fit in. It's a job where you're out in the water. Sometimes you're out when it's cold and it's, sea conditions aren't great. And, maybe people are getting seasick. And there are days like that. And, we need people who aren't going to say oh, well, it's cold, so I don't want to go out in the boat.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Just a little bit of hardiness, I think, is important.
I mean, and I would like to think that anyone applying to work with you would be aware of that. But as we just said a few moments ago, our norms are not their norms. So do you ever get or ask one of your other tour guys to say, hey, sit down with John, sit down with Jane. They're interested in working with us. You give them the lowdown on your day-to-day, the highs and the lows. Don't sugarcoat anything, and allow them to have a discussion. And also for that experienced tour guide to then evaluate that person and come back to you and say, actually, I don't think they cut out for it.
Nothing that explicit, but we have multiple people from our team interview. There's never just one person interviewing somebody or one person looking at resumes or something. There's usually a couple people, but we do have some separation. So, sort of have a head captain, and, he is primarily the one who is managing the captains and the crew. So from my perspective, I'm whether I like the person or not doesn't really matter, because I'm not managing them. I'm not the one who has to work with them. Right. So I have tried to give the authority to say, you're going to live and die by these people. Right. And if one of these people doesn't work out, it's actually a bigger problem for you than it is for me, because you're going to be a guy short. You're going to have to work an extra day, all these things. So I try to make sure that multiple people are involved in the hiring process and that they're taking ownership for it.
Great. Your third value bomb is understand the relationship between cost and value. Can you help us understand what you mean by that?
I think a lot of small business owners, owner-operators, they like to do things themselves because they trust themselves, but also because they don't want to spend the money on someone else doing it. So an example would be, could you hire somebody for not that much to help you on a day-to-day basis just to run errands. So like a lot of small business owners, they might be the ones who are, running around picking up parts or supplies or things like that. And I think my brother-in-law, has really hammered home a really important concept, which is ROTI, return on time invested. And if you're the person running the business, presumably you could spend your time doing higher value add things than, running to the grocery store to pick up some hot dogs because they're out. And so a lot of small business owners have a hard time letting go a little bit. And I think there are areas in most smaller businesses that the owners would actually benefit a lot, not necessarily financially, but emotionally, from allowing other people to do that work for them. The second component of value versus cost, as an example, would be, well, first of all, there's like 1,000 examples of value versus cost when you're operating boats, because you don't want to buy a cheap part and, have it break, because then that results in more downtime. So, anything to do with maintenance for us is always about value. So something could cost twice as much as something else, but if it's going to, come from a reputable manufacturer, be more reliable, then that's worth it every day. Even in COVID times, you don't want to save, what is it? Penny wise, pound foolish.
Especially with a boat at sea. I mean, walking tour maybe.
Yeah, if our boats aren't operating, you can't do anything. So we're not making any revenue. So to be, stingy on $1,000 part when you might lose $10,000 if you can't operate is like foolish. The big thing for us has actually been in marketing. So this year we hired a marketing firm. They're on retainer. We spent money social media. And that's something that is scary to do because we're paying them a monthly retainer, whether we get results or not. We're spending money on ad spend, which, can feel like it's just going out into the ether, and it's a significant cost for us. And we had to say, there's a chance that this actually generates a lot more revenue for us than the cost. So if we're only looking at the cost line item for marketing, it's gone up from, we bought brochures in the past and we're in a couple of local sort of ads, but to go from that to a full-fledged marketing campaign is a significant investment. And I think a lot of small business owners would just probably look at the retainer portion of it and say, like, I'm just not going to do it. But for us, we've done it with great success and we've made many multiples more in revenue. We've covered the cost of the ad spend and our retainer many, many times over. And if we hadn't taken the chance to invest in the business and invest in this area that previously the company didn't have any exposure to, because we were being so concerned with the cost, we wouldn't have gotten to see, the value that could be created by going down that route. So that's sort of another example of sometimes paying for things can actually, generate more revenue for you, but you have to kind of hold your breath while you're getting into it.
It's hard. I mean, we're talking about it here. You've put it into practice, but when you see those bills every month that you have to pay, how much hard work has gone into that. And it's interesting you brought up marketing, because one of the things I want to do on future episodes of the show is I want to dig a little bit more into the decisions behind appraising marketing agencies, because as you know, there's hundreds of them out there. Some are great, some are not so great, and it can be a money pit. So I want to produce episodes where we talk with marketing agencies. We bring some operators together and we have the agency on the show, and we talk through some of the things that are important for tourpreneurs, because it's a tricky decision to make and it can be quite costly, but it could also be the game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we got lucky. Ours was not a big agency, small group of guys, and they do mostly fishing tour excursion,
right?
Social media and stuff like that.
But they had some understanding of your industry, of your vertical. Yeah.
And I think that was very important. We certainly could have gone with a fancier firm or someone who's a bit more flashy, but the fact that they understood that we're a, small operator, kind of like, in the tourism space, they understood seasonality.
Yeah.
That there's a ebb and flow to our season. and when you want to spend money and when you don't. Like for us, there's not a lot of point spending a lot of money in social media in October because like the season's over. But, I had to be educated. In my head, I was like, okay, well, we'll start spending money in May because that's when our season starts. And they're like, well, no, you need to start spending money in April because first of all, when you have a new ad, a lot of the algorithms take at least a week to get up to speed on what you're trying to do. And then it takes another couple of weeks to fine tune it to make sure that you're reaching the right people. And so they're like, if you're starting on May 15th, you really need to start your campaign for the month on April 15th because like otherwise you're late. Really, you should probably start at April 1st so that when the season starts, you're ready to go. That's something I had no idea about, and I was, they first said it, I was very skeptical that we need to start in April. I was like, you're just trying to get me to spend money. I don't want to do it, but I took their advice and it has worked out very well for us. And I think it's partly because they understood the type of business that we're in.
I think that's very important. And again, you're proving your point about value versus cost because you could have gone on a course, a Facebook ads course or digital marketing course. You could have spent thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours learning all that. Whereas you've gone out, you've hired someone, and you can spend that time then with your employees or growing the business in other areas. And I do recognize for a lot of operators out there, we haven't seen revenue for 12 months. I'm thinking of especially the big cities, New York City, DC, they've been really struggling. Outdoors, adventure, nature has been doing reasonably well. In some areas, I'm hearing breaking records, which blows my mind when you consider what we're going through. So I do want to respect that. But the minute when you do start making revenue, it's like, okay. And a good example is here with this podcast. I used to edit every single episode myself. That would take me 4 hours because I was learning it. And also what you were saying at the start, I was a bit of a control freak. I felt like, well, no, I've held the conversation. I've conducted the interview. I know best where to edit it. But my editor does a fantastic job. That saves me 4 or 5 hours a week when I can prep, for our interview, or I can do guest outreach, wherever it may be, go on a tour even, hopefully.
Yep.
So I'm definitely in your camp there. In terms of marketing, how are you working with resellers and OTAs? Is that part of your marketing mix?
A little bit. In the past, there was like a lot of bus tours that would come through. Obviously, in 2020, there were zero. And this year, it's been hit or miss from like a group tour perspective. Candidly, most things for the fall have started to be canceled at this point, which is a bummer. And I really feel for the people that we work with. So that part has been slow, to say the least. We do have some relationships with like resellers and stuff like that. It's been something we've been testing out. But last year, because we didn't know if we would open, and then we had pretty big capacity limits set on us, we basically said, I'm going to take all the revenue I can get and not want to split any of it with elsewhere, because we thought we could fill the capacity ourselves. And so this year we've started doing a little bit more of it. I suspect it'll be something we'll look more into it in the off season. But I would say we're novices in that area. 80% of our ticket sales are just direct on the website.
Fantastic. No, that's something you should be proud of as well. And most of us would kill for that.
I bought it. I didn't make it.
True. Well, that was a savvy decision on your part. I'm sure that was one of the reasons why you acquired it. On that note as well, I saw that you are working for your online bookings with Fair Harbor. Was that something you brought in, or was it something that existed already?
No, the previous owner installed it at the end of the 2019 season. So it was new to the business, but he made the decision and said he was switching over. And it's been a really good, well, I don't know anything else. So.
Oh, crikey. You got to get sales calls now when people listening to this.
Yeah, exactly. But it has been a very good experience for us so far.
That's really good to hear. I know you mentioned earlier on, you have a family, you run several businesses. How do you go about achieving any kind of work-life balance, Trish?
Well, my husband and I call it work-life blending.
Nice.
And I actually think I have a great balance in that I get to work with family, which for some people is a terrible proposition for us. It's awesome and we love it. And so we get to build something together, which is just a super fun adventure. And we get to support each other when things are difficult. That's a really sort of special experience as well. I benefit greatly at Captain Fish, specifically from having a wonderful team who are very competent, which is sort of a baseline, but who want ownership of their responsibilities. Because if they didn't want ownership of their responsibilities, then I would have to do a lot more things than I do now. But I sort of believe that if you have competent people and they want the ball, then it's my responsibility as the decision maker to give it to them and see what they can do. So that philosophy helps make it so that I'm not, feeling like I'm the only person who can do things.
Trish, thanks a million for coming on the show today and sharing your 3 value bombs with us. I know there are many tourpreneurs out there listening that will be inspired by what you've said today, especially about getting even our books in order. I think a lot of us are going to be tackling that one as a result of hearing you on the show today. And Maine is still on my list. I live in Vermont and I still haven't made it across to Maine, and you're definitely on my list to come visit. So hopefully it'll probably be next year now, because this year is flying by. I'll definitely come and get on one of your boat tours. I'll be excited to come see some whales.
Yeah, sounds great. We'd love to have you anytime. And I'd also say that if anybody is, interested in any of the stuff that I talked about, if they're thinking about preparing to sell their business or even if it's selling to a family member or anything like that, my email is trish@captainfish.com, and always happy to chat.
That's so generous of you. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Trish.
Of course. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Tourpreneur podcast. Be sure to visit tourpreneur.com to join the conversation and access the show notes, including links to the resources mentioned on today's episode. This is Tourpreneur.